The Diary of a Killer. A terrifying journey you won't forget. Hook. Imagine being trapped inside your own nightmare, where every choice you make leads you deeper into darkness. What if the story you're living was never meant to end? Stay with me till the very end, because the shocking twist is about to reveal the truth. There is no escape. Don't blink, or you might miss it. The dim light flickered in the corner of the room. Shadows stretched across the walls, dancing with the faint, unstable glow. I sat at the desk, hands trembling. The diary lay before me, its worn leather cover cold to the touch. The ink was smudged on the first page, but the words were still legible. Each line had a rhythm, a pulse, almost as if the author had breathed life into them. I flipped through the pages slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. There was a stench in the air, not of decay, but something darker, something I couldn't quite place. The words grew more erratic as I read. They spoke of a hunter, a predator lurking in the shadows. The ink splattered across some of the pages, as if the author had written in a frenzy. I could almost hear their breath quickening with every word. I hesitated, then turned to the next page. The entries became more disturbing, more vivid. Details of the killings, descriptions of the victims, their last moments. My stomach churned, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know. Each page felt like a descent into madness. The air grew heavier, thicker. A sense of being watched crept up my spine. I glanced around the room, heart pounding. The floor creaked underfoot. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. I returned to the diary, my hands sweating. The next entry was dated yesterday. It sent a chill through my bones. The handwriting was different, more erratic. The last victim had been described in intimate detail. Their face, their screams, their final breath. I swallowed hard. I turned the page, and then there it was. A name. My name. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. I stared at the words, my vision blurring. The room seemed to close in around me. Was it a mistake? I looked again, but the letters were unmistakable. And beneath my name, there was one last line. A chilling promise. I'm watching you. My heart raced, pounding in my chest. The room felt colder, the walls pressing in. I could barely breathe. The diary slipped from my hands, landing with a soft thud on the wooden floor. I didn't dare move. A sharp sound came from the corner of the room. Someone was there. I froze, eyes darting to the shadows, expecting to see something. But the corner was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt it, the weight of unseen eyes. I forced myself to stand, legs shaky, almost giving way beneath me. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it. A low creak, as if the door had opened on its own. Slowly, deliberately. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I heard footsteps, slow and measured. The sound of them growing closer, one step at a time. I turned back to the diary almost instinctively. I had to see it again, had to understand it. But the pages, they were blank. All of them. Every page, except for the first. I slammed the book shut, my breath quickening. The footsteps were right behind me now. I turned, heart pounding, stomach lurching. The room was empty. I backed into the wall, eyes searching every corner, every shadow. But there was nothing, just silence, and then a whisper, soft, cold. Did you think you could escape? My blood ran cold. It came from everywhere, the walls, the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps. You're already part of the story, the voice whispered again. I didn't move. I couldn't. And then the light went out. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The air was thick, like I was breathing through water. I reached out, fingers trembling, feeling for something, anything. The faintest echo of my breath was the only sound. Then a sharp breath, a gasp. It wasn't mine. I froze. It came from just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. The walls seemed to pulse, the darkness alive, shifting. I couldn't make sense of it, but then I heard it again. A whisper. This time closer. Don't worry. You'll be fine. The voice was calm, soothing, but there's something so wrong about it. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. My legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in that suffocating darkness. A single click of a door opening. I could hear it now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Each step echoing, growing louder. I forced myself to move, to stumble forward. I couldn't stay here, but I wasn't sure where to go. The darkness was consuming me, and then a glint, a small sliver of light from the corner of the room. I darted toward it, desperate. As I got closer, the light grew brighter. I reached out, hand trembling. The door. It was open. A thin line of light spilled from the crack. I pushed against the door. It creaked open. The world beyond was blurred, like I was stepping into a dream. But then I saw something. A shadow in the doorway. A figure standing still. I gasped, mouth dry. It was him. The figure I had read about in the diary. His eyes were cold, hollow. He stepped forward, slowly. And with each step, the door behind me slammed shut. The door slammed with a deafening crash, locking me in. I spun around, panic rising. There was no escape. The figure moved closer, his steps heavy on the floor. His face remained hidden in shadow, but I could feel his presence. I backed away, heart hammering. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic thud of his footsteps. Closer, closer. I could almost feel the cold of his breath against my skin. I pressed myself against the wall, hands shaking, but he didn't stop. His eyes, two dark pools of nothingness, locked onto mine. The air between us felt suffocating, like a vice tightening around my chest. My mind raced, but there was no plan, no way out. He stepped forward again, moving with a terrifying calm. I could smell the faint scent of something metallic, blood. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I felt trapped in a nightmare. I tried to move, to break free, but my legs refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot. He reached out, his fingers long and pale. I braced myself, eyes wide. He stopped, just inches from me. The room was deathly silent. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching endlessly. Then he spoke, his voice low and smooth. You shouldn't have read it. His words cut through the silence like a blade. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. You think you've escaped, he continued, but the story is far from over. I felt his hand on my shoulder, cold. And then the lights flickered again. Faster this time, almost frantically. I could see his face now, a twisted grin spreading across his features. But his eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, held no mercy. They burned into me, and as the lights went out, I heard him whisper one last thing. You're already part of the ending. The darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't breathe. The silence was deafening. I stood there, frozen, not knowing if I was even still standing. I felt weightless, like I was floating in an endless void. The air was thick, suffocating. The silence pressed against my ears, ringing with the absence of sound. I couldn't tell if time had stopped or if I had simply lost track of it. And then a light. A single, sharp beam of white cutting through the dark. I blinked, my eyes adjusting. The light was blinding, but it was something real. Something solid. I stumbled toward it, every step feeling like it took an eternity. As I approached, the light revealed a figure standing in the center of it. A figure I recognized. The same twisted grin. The same cold, hollow eyes. The same figure from the shadows. He was standing there waiting. And for the first time, he wasn't moving. He was just watching. The light seemed to bend around him, distorting as if it couldn't quite touch him. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The closer I got, the more the room around him seemed to distort. The walls stretched, bent, flickered in and out of focus. I stopped. The distance between us seemed too far to cross now. I could feel the heaviness in the air pressing down on me, like the weight of the world had settled on my chest. His grin widened. "Do you know where you are now?" he asked, his voice a rasping whisper that slithered through the air. I swallowed hard, but no words came. It didn't matter. The room, it wasn't a room at all. It was a page, a blank, endless page. The walls weren't real. They were ink. The floor beneath my feet was ink. The very air I breathed was ink. And I was part of it. I was part of the story. He stepped closer, and as he did, the world began to crumble, bit by bit. Each piece of the room, every shadow, every flicker of light, it all turned to dust. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The story was taking me, and there was no escaping it. The ground beneath me trembled. I could feel it breaking, crumbling away like paper disintegrating in water. The walls, no, the pages, bent, warped, and twisted. I was falling, but there was no floor to fall to. I kept falling, deeper into the void. The light, the figure, the room, everything was slipping away, like a bad dream fading as I woke up. I reached out, trying to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing. Just endless blackness, swirling with dark ink, consuming everything. The world I had known, the life I had lived, all of it was dissolving. And then the voice, that familiar, chilling whisper. "You thought you were free." The words wrapped around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I could feel them like cold fingers tight around my throat. "No one escapes their own story," the voice continued. "You wrote it. You were always part of it." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was no breath left in me, no strength. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller, as if the very fabric of my being was being erased. And then I saw it. A single page, floating in the endless dark. It was my story. I could see the words written there, twisted, sharp, like they were etched into my very soul. Each word was a memory, a moment, a decision that had led me here. I reached out, trembling, trying to touch the page, but as my fingers brushed against the ink, it began to bleed. Black, thick ink that pooled and spread, covering the page, the world. The ink, it was alive. It moved, swirling, turning into shapes, forming into a shadow. The figure was there again, but this time his eyes were not hollow. They were full of everything I had ever feared. He stepped closer, and the darkness around him pulsed like a heartbeat. "I am the story," he whispered. "You are nothing more than the ink that writes it." And in that moment I realized I wasn't escaping. I was the story. The ink swirled around me, tightening like a noose. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every word, every page, every moment of the story was dragging me deeper into the darkness. I was being rewritten, reshaped by something far beyond my control. The figure's eyes never left me, watching with a twisted satisfaction. "You think you have free will," he said, his voice slow and cruel. "But every choice you made, I wrote it." The ink pooled at my feet, climbing up my legs, cold and thick like tar. I tried to fight it, to pull away, but it was everywhere now. It was in me. It was part of me. My mind screamed for escape, but all I could hear was his voice, growing louder, echoing in the void. "The story never ends," he whispered. "Not for you. Not for anyone." The ink reached my waist, crawling up my chest. It felt like hands, cold and slick, wrapping around me, pulling me into the very fabric of the story. I tried to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't form. I was losing myself, losing everything. "Did you think you could fight the author?" he sneered. "You're just a character, a page waiting to be written, erased, rewritten." The world around me began to fold, the ink folding into itself, creating dark corridors that stretched into infinity. There was no escape. There never had been. I felt myself slipping into the ink, my body dissolving, becoming part of the darkness. And then something shifted. A crack in the ink, a small sliver of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart race. I reached for it. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed against the ink. The light pulsed, brighter now, like a beacon calling me home. I grabbed at it, pulling myself through the layers of darkness. And just as the ink threatened to consume me entirely, I broke free. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the void anymore. I was back in the room with the diary. The pages were still there, still open to the first entry. I was gasping for air, my skin covered in cold sweat. I looked around, but there was no figure, no darkness, just the faint rustle of the pages, whispering, "Welcome back." And I knew it had all been part of the story. I was never meant to escape, that I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The room was still, too still, like the air had been suspended in time. I looked at the diary again, the words staring back at me, unchanged. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the noise deafening in the silence. It was impossible. I couldn't be back here. I couldn't be back in the same place. But everything felt the same. The shadows in the corners, the flickering light above, the coldness of the air. I stood there, trembling, unable to tear my eyes away from the diary. The pages seemed to ripple, as if alive. The ink bled, darker now, more vivid. I reached out, fingers hovering above the first page. I had to stop. I couldn't read any more, but my hand betrayed me. It descended, touching the paper, and as soon as I made contact, the room seemed to shift. The walls bent, the floor beneath me groaned, and the darkness crept in. It was happening again. I could feel it. The ink was alive, surging up from the pages, covering my fingers, spreading like fire. I tried to pull away, but it held me fast. I felt it crawling under my skin, into my veins, my mind. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed whole by the growing darkness. The figure appeared again, standing in the corner, watching me. His cold eyes gleamed. "You didn't learn," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You never do." I struggled, but the ink was everywhere now. It was choking me, suffocating me. I felt the weight of the pages pressing down on me, closing in, the words becoming heavier and heavier. The world around me blurred, everything twisting, reshaping. And then it stopped. I was standing in the middle of the room again, gasping for air. But something was different. The figure was gone. The shadows had retreated. The diary lay closed on the desk, untouched. I reached for it, trembling. The pages turned slowly, each one heavier than the last. And when I reached the final page, I saw it. My name, written in thick, dark ink. And beneath it, a single line. "Endings are just another beginning." The last word shimmered, as if it had just been written. I knew then this was it. There was no escaping. I was part of the story. And the story would never end. The room seemed to pulse around me, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I stared at the final line, my name scrawled across the page. The ink began to shift, as though it were alive, writhing on the paper. My heart hammered in my chest as the words seemed to bleed, stretching and twisting before my eyes. I tried to step back, but my legs felt frozen. The diary began to tremble, vibrating on the desk, as if something was trying to break free from within it. I reached for it instinctively, but the moment my fingers touched the book again, a sharp pain shot through my body, like something was clawing at me from the inside. I gasped, struggling to pull away, but it was too late. The room blurred, the shadows stretching and swallowing the space around me. I could feel it, the weight of the story, the force of it pulling me in. And then the darkness exploded. It was all-consuming, a rush of sound, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, filled my ears. I felt myself being ripped apart, piece by piece, the story unraveling me. But I didn't fade. I didn't disappear. I was still there. No, I was everywhere. The room around me was gone. The walls, the desk, the diary, they were all nothing now. I was no longer a person. I was just a fragment of the story, a single word, drifting endlessly. And somewhere in the distance I heard the voice again. It was soft at first, almost a whisper. Did you really think you could change the ending? I couldn't speak. There were no words left for me. I was just ink, just a story. The voice echoed once more. Everyone is part of it. We always are. The darkness swirled around me, growing thicker, suffocating. I realized too late. I was never the writer. I was always the written. And now there's no end. Only the story. The darkness pressed in, suffocating every breath I tried to take. There was no air, no room to move, only the heavy weight of the story. It surrounded me, wrapping me in its endless folds, its endless lines. I could feel every word, every syllable, carving into my very being. It wasn't just ink anymore. It was me. I was the story, and the story was me. There was no distinction. The voice whispered again, colder now, more triumphant. You thought you could escape. The words swirled around me like smoke, filling my mind. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body wasn't mine to control. I could feel the edges of the story folding around me, turning me into another chapter, another paragraph, another ending. But as the words continued to suffocate me, something shifted. A faint crack appeared in the ink, a sliver of light, a glimmer of something real, something outside of the story. I reached for it, my mind screaming for release. The light was small, distant, but it pulsed with warmth. I strained, pulling myself toward it. The ink pushed back, swirling with fury, trying to drag me back into the endless void. But I fought harder. The crack widened. The light grew brighter. With one final, desperate push, I broke free from the ink's grip. I was outside. I was breathing. The air was cold, but it was real. I stumbled forward, my body aching, my mind reeling from the pull of the story. I looked around. I wasn't in the room anymore. I was standing in a long hallway, the walls lined with doors. Each one had a name written on it. My name was still fresh in my mind, but now it felt distant, like a dream fading into the background. I approached one of the doors, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, but the door opened easily, revealing a dark, endless expanse. I stepped through, and then the light blinked out again. I was back in the story. And this time, it didn't matter where I went. It didn't matter how hard I fought, because I was the story, and the story was never finished. The darkness surged once more, overwhelming me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The air felt thick and sticky, like the very atmosphere was part of the ink that had consumed everything around me. I stood there, trapped in the endless void, my heart beating wildly in my chest. I tried to focus, tried to break free, but each thought I had seemed to slip through my fingers like sand. No matter how hard I clawed at the edges of this story, it was always there, pulling me back in. I turned, the void stretching in every direction, but there was nothing. Only the whispering voice again, cold and smooth. You still think you have a choice. It echoed in my mind, reverberating through every cell in my body. Your path was written long before you ever opened that diary. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't form them. I was losing myself, my thoughts disintegrating like dust in the wind. Then a flicker, a sharp light, piercing through the blackness. It was distant but steady. I reached for it. My body obeyed, my hands shaking as I stepped forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The light grew brighter with every movement, but as it expanded, the shadows around me seemed to deepen, growing darker and more oppressive. I couldn't stop. I had to get to it. The closer I came, the more the voice grew louder, like a rising crescendo of dread. You can't escape the story, it whispered, its words sinking into my skin, into my very bones. But the light was in front of me now, and with a final, desperate cry, I reached out. I touched it. The moment my fingers brushed against the light, the world around me fractured, splintering like glass. For a moment, everything went silent. Then it shattered. The light engulfed me, bright and pure, and the darkness screamed in agony, retreating from the blaze. I felt myself torn apart, broken down into nothing. But then, a gasp. I was awake. I was here. I stood in the middle of an empty room. The walls were bare. The air was still. The diary, it was gone. There was no trace of it, no ink, no words. Just silence. I was free, or so I thought, because when I turned toward the door, I saw it. A single line, written in thick, dark ink on the wall. Every story has an end, but not yours. And the shadows began to stir. I stood still, eyes wide, heart pounding. The words on the wall seemed to pulse, as if alive, dark ink bleeding into the air around me. I stepped back, every instinct screaming for me to leave, to escape this place. But there was nowhere to go. I turned slowly, the room around me beginning to distort. The walls felt closer, the space tighter, as if the very air was closing in. The shadows moved. I could feel them creeping along the floor, stretching out from every corner. They reached for me, slow but certain. I stumbled back, but my legs were weak, my body exhausted from the endless cycle. The shadows grew taller, darker, and from them a figure emerged. It was him again, the figure from the story, the one who had haunted me from the first page. His eyes, hollow and cold, locked onto mine. "You think you can escape, don't you?" he whispered, his voice calm, almost affectionate. "I told you, there is no end." I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. The air was thick with his presence, the shadows wrapping around me, pulling me toward him. I felt it again, that horrible sensation of being drawn back into the story, of losing myself in the ink. I struggled, tried to break free, but I was trapped. I had always been trapped. He stepped closer, his face a twisted mask of amusement. "You are part of the story now," he said softly. "The beginning, the middle, the end. They are all just one thread." I reached out, desperate to grasp onto something real, but my fingers slipped through the air like it wasn't even there. "No," I gasped, finally finding my voice. "I refuse. I won't be part of this anymore." But the figure just smiled, cold and knowing. "You have no choice. You never did." And then, with a single step, he was gone. And the room was dark again. The story wasn't finished. Not yet. It never would be. The darkness swirled around me, thick and suffocating. I was alone, or so it seemed. I stood in the center of the room, the walls pressing in on me, the shadows still stretching like unseen fingers reaching, waiting. I could feel the weight of it all, of the ink, of the story, pushing down, suffocating me. But something within me stirred, a spark, tiny but persistent. I couldn't explain it, but it was there, a sense of defiance rising within my chest. I had been trapped. I had been consumed by the story, pulled into its endless cycle. But now, in the midst of the darkness, I realized something. I was the one who held the pen. The thought was a revelation. I was the story, yes, but I could still write. The room shuddered as if it recognized the shift in my mind, the change in the air. The ink that had once felt like chains now seemed less threatening, less all-consuming. It was a tool, a medium, not a prison. I reached out, my hands trembling, and felt the air crackle with power. With every word, every sentence, I could feel the story changing. The darkness that had surrounded me began to recede, to dissolve into nothing. The walls of the room shifted, expanding outward, as if the very space was being rewritten, remade. I stood taller, my breathing steadying. The figure, the one who had haunted me for so long, was gone. The shadows were gone. Everything that had once defined this place, this story, began to fade. And in its place, I wrote something new. I wrote freedom. I wrote light. I wrote an ending, a real one. The ink that had once threatened to consume me now spread across the room, gentle and warm, painting a new future. The air cleared. The room was no longer oppressive. It was a place of calm, of peace. I took a step forward, and this time it felt like a step toward something real. The story had come to its end, and I was no longer part of it. I was free,